The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the immaculate lawns of Peacock Manor as the annual Street Mary Mead garden fete reached its pleasant crescendo. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a weathered wooden bench near the prize-winning roses, observed the familiar choreography of village social life with the quiet attention of someone who had witnessed such gatherings for decades. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked on a pale blue cardigan, though her mild grey eyes missed nothing of the interactions unfolding around her. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, the manor's elegant mistress, glided between the white-clothed tables with practiced grace, her silver hair gleaming in the dappled sunlight. She paused frequently to exchange pleasantries with villagers, though Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her shoulders whenever conversation turned to her nephew Julian, who had recently returned from London under circumstances the village whispered about but never quite articulated. The famous Peacock Alley stretched beyond the main lawn, where ornamental peacocks strutted between carefully manicured topiary hedges. The secluded area, with its ornate fountain and charming summer house, had been the manor's pride for 3 generations. Today, however, it seemed strangely quiet, the peacocks having retreated to shadier corners. Dr. Timothy Hartwell, the village's young physician, stood near the tea table, engaged in animated conversation with Sarah Wickham, the postmaster's daughter. Miss Marple observed how Sarah's eyes frequently darted toward the manor's east wing, where Julian Ashworth had established his temporary residence. The doctor's obvious affection for the young woman was touching, though Miss Marple suspected complications lay beneath the surface. Reverend Michael Thornbury moved through the crowd with his characteristic warmth, yet Miss Marple detected an unusual preoccupation in his manner. He kept glancing toward his pocket watch, and twice she had seen him peer anxiously down the path leading to Peacock Alley, most curious indeed. At 4:30, Mrs. Ashworth clapped her hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, shall we announce this year's flower competition winners?" The crowd began gathering around the prize table, their cheerful chatter creating a pleasant buzz of anticipation. Children darted between adult legs, their laughter bright as scattered coins. Young Tommy Fletcher, the baker's son, had been exploring the grounds with the fearless curiosity of 12-year-old boys. Miss Marple had watched him venture toward Peacock Alley some minutes earlier, drawn perhaps by the mysterious quiet that had settled over that usually vibrant area. His scream shattered the afternoon's gentle harmony like a stone through glass. Tommy came running from the alley, his face chalk white, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to reach the adults. He gasped, struggling for breath. "In the summer house. There's someone. I think they're dead." The festive atmosphere collapsed instantly. Mrs. Ashworth's hand flew to her throat, her composed facade cracking. Dr. Hartwell immediately stepped forward, his medical training overriding social convention. "Show me where, quickly, lad." The crowd followed in stunned silence as Tommy led them down the tree-lined path. There, in the elegant summer house that overlooked the fountain, they found Mr. Arthur Finch slumped in a wicker chair, his sharp features peaceful in death, a teacup still balanced on the small table beside him. Dr. Hartwell's examination was brief but thorough. He looked up grimly. "I'm afraid Mr. Finch has been dead for some time." As shocked murmurs rippled through the gathering, Miss Marple quietly approached the summer house entrance. Her keen eyes noted the undisturbed teacup, the single peacock feather on the floor, and most intriguingly, the faint scent of bitter almonds that seemed to linger in the still air. The peaceful village of Street Mary, Mead had just experienced murder most foul. The stunned silence that followed Dr. Hartwell's pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly across the manicured grounds of Peacock Manor. Mrs. Ashworth, her composure cracking like fine porcelain under pressure, gripped the summerhouse door frame with white-knuckled fingers. "Surely there must be some mistake," she whispered, though her voice carried little conviction. Dr. Hartwell shook his head grimly, stepping carefully away from the scene. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Ashworth. The bitter almond scent is quite distinct, I suspect cyanide poisoning." We must contact the authorities immediately and ensure no one disturbs anything further." The word poison rippled through the gathered villagers like a stone cast into still water. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her handbag closer, while Major Palgrave muttered something about foul play in broad daylight. Young Tommy Fletcher, still pale from his discovery, edged closer to Miss Marple's reassuring presence. "I heard something just before I found him," Tommy said quietly to Miss Marple, his voice barely above a whisper. "A tiny sound, like a teaspoon clinking against china. But when I looked, there wasn't anyone else around." Miss Marple's mild grey eyes sharpened with interest. "How very observant of you, Tommy. Such details can be quite important." She glanced toward the summer house, noting that while a delicate porcelain teacup sat pristine on its saucer, no spoon was visible anywhere on the small wicker table. Sarah Wickham hurried toward the manor to telephone the police, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. Dr. Hartwell watched her go with concern, then turned to address the crowd. "Everyone should move back to the main lawn. We mustn't contaminate the scene." As the villagers reluctantly retreated, Miss Marple observed their varied reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature. Reverend Thornbury continued his nervous habit of checking his pocket watch, while Mrs. Dolly Bantry approached with her typical directness. "Jane, this is absolutely dreadful," Mrs. Bantry declared. "I saw Mr. Finch at the post office yesterday morning, collecting a registered letter. He seemed quite pleased about something most unusual for such a reserved gentleman." This detail caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Arthur Finch had been a quiet man of modest means since arriving in Street Mary Mead 18 months ago. What correspondence might have brought him such evident satisfaction? The sound of approaching footsteps announced Julian Ashworth's belated arrival from the manor's east wing. His hair was disheveled, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and his face bore the unmistakable pallor of someone who had received shocking news second-hand. "Aunt Cordelia, what's happened?" "Mrs. Tanner said there'd been an accident." He stopped abruptly upon seeing the summer house, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching fear. "Good God, is that Mr. Finch?" "I'm afraid Mr. Finch has been murdered, Julian," Mrs. Ashworth replied, her voice steadier now that her nephew had appeared. "Where were you?" The entire village heard young Tommy's cry. Julian's explanation came haltingly. "I was resting. I had a headache and drew the curtains. I must not have heard." His eyes darted between his aunt and the summer house, and Miss Marple noted how his hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. Within minutes, Constable Reeves arrived on his bicycle, red-faced and flustered. Behind him came Inspector Slack's familiar motor car, announcing the arrival of the county's detective with characteristic efficiency. The inspector, a man who favored swift conclusions over careful deliberation, strode purposefully toward the scene. As the official investigation began, Miss Marple settled herself on a nearby bench, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. The peaceful garden party had transformed into something far more sinister. But she had learned long ago that patience and careful observation often revealed truths that escaped more hurried investigators. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Peacock Alley, and with them, the mystery was only beginning to unfold. Inspector Slack surveyed the summer house with the methodical precision of a man who preferred swift conclusions to prolonged mysteries. His sharp eyes took in every detail: the undisturbed teacup, the peaceful expression on Mr. Finch's face, and the faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds that still lingered in the afternoon air. He announced briskly, withdrawing a small black notebook. "Dr. Hartwell, I'll need your professional assessment. Time of death, cause, the usual particulars." Hartwell stepped forward, his medical training overriding any social discomfort. "Based on the body temperature and rigor, I'd estimate death occurred between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. The bitter almond odor strongly suggests cyanide poisoning, a rapid-acting substance that would have caused death within minutes of ingestion." "And this teacup?" Inspector Slack gestured toward the delicate china, sitting innocuously on its saucer. Almost certainly the delivery method, Dr. Hartwell confirmed grimly. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily as she recalled young Tommy's observation. Inspector, the boy mentioned hearing a spoon against china just before discovering the body, yet I notice there's no spoon visible on the table. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened immediately. Constable Reeves, search the area thoroughly. If there's a spoon about, I want it found. He turned back to the assembled villagers. Now then, who was responsible for serving tea this afternoon? Mrs. Ashworth, having regained much of her composure, stepped forward. The church ladies managed the tea service. Mrs. Bantry supervised, and several volunteers helped distribute cups throughout the afternoon. Sarah Wickham was among them. Sarah, still pale from the shock, nodded nervously. I filled cups at the main table, but people collected them as they wished. I didn't specifically serve Mr. Finch. Yet someone did, Inspector Slack observed pointedly. His gaze swept over Julian Ashworth, who stood slightly apart from the group, his earlier cigarette replaced by another that trembled between his fingers. Mr. Ashworth, you mentioned you were resting during the crucial period. Can anyone verify your whereabouts? Julian's flush deepened. I was alone, as I said. I've been having difficulty sleeping since returning from London. The doctor prescribed something for my nerves. What sort of difficulties in London? Inspector Slack pressed, his tone growing noticeably sharper. Before Julian could respond, Mrs. Bantry interjected with her characteristic directness. Inspector, you should know that Mr. Finch received a registered letter yesterday. Sarah saw him at the post office, looking quite pleased about something. This information caused a visible reaction in Julian, whose face went ashen. Miss Marple observed this change with quiet interest, noting how his hands trembled more noticeably as he attempted to light his cigarette. A solicitor's letter, Inspector Slack mused, making notes. That's worth investigating. Miss Wickham, you're certain about the sender? Sarah nodded reluctantly. The envelope bore their crest. Mr. Finch seemed, well, happier than I'd ever seen him. Found it, sir, Constable Reeves called from beneath the summer house. He emerged, holding a delicate silver teaspoon, tarnished with age but otherwise unremarkable. It was pushed well under Mr. Finch's chair, almost hidden. Miss Marple's mild grey eyes brightened with interest. Someone had taken considerable care to conceal the spoon after the poisoning, but why? The action suggested both premeditation and an attempt to obscure evidence. Inspector Slack examined the spoon carefully. This tells us our murderer had time to tidy up after the deed. Not a crime of sudden passion, but calculated murder. His gaze returned to Julian with obvious suspicion. Mr. Ashworth, what was the nature of your business difficulties in London? Julian's defensive posture crumbled slightly. There were some debts, investment losses, nothing that would concern Mr. Finch. But Miss Marple noticed how Julian's eyes kept returning to the teacup as if it held some personal significance. She also observed that Reverend Thornbury continued checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency. His earlier appointment with Mr. Finch apparently weighing heavily on his mind. The peaceful garden party had indeed transformed into something far more sinister, and Inspector Slack's investigation was only beginning to uncover the web of secrets that had led to murder most deliberate. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation required formal statements from all present, and he commandeered Mrs. Ashworth's library for the purpose. The room, with its leather-bound volumes and heavy oak furniture, provided a suitably serious atmosphere for what had become a murder inquiry. Miss Marple, with her characteristic ability to blend into any setting, settled quietly in a corner chair with her knitting, appearing to all the world like a harmless elderly lady who had simply wandered in from the garden. Reverend Thornbury was summoned first, his earlier agitation now impossible to conceal. He twisted his pocket watch chain nervously as Inspector Slack's penetrating gaze settled upon him. "Reverend, you seemed particularly distressed by Mr. Finch's death. Did you know him well?" "Not well, no," Thornbury admitted, his voice strained. "But I had arranged to meet with him this afternoon, at precisely 3:45 in the summer house." The admission hung heavy in the air, and several villagers exchanged meaningful glances. "A pastoral visit?" Inspector Slack's pen poised over his notebook. "Mr. Finch had contacted me yesterday evening after receiving his registered letter. He said he had a matter of conscience to discuss something about setting things right regarding money. He seemed quite agitated about whatever he had learned." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. A man who had lived quietly for 18 months, suddenly receiving legal correspondence and immediately seeking spiritual counsel about financial matters, the pattern suggested secrets long buried were finally surfacing. "Did you keep this appointment?" Inspector Slack pressed. Reverend Thornbury's flush deepened. "I was detained by Mrs. Weatherby about the raffle arrangements. When I finally reached the summer house at 10 minutes past 4, young Tommy had already made his dreadful discovery. I never had the chance to speak with Mr. Finch about whatever was troubling him. When Sarah Wickham was called forward, her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress. I helped serve tea from the main urn," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "People generally helped themselves to milk and sugar. Mr. Finch was quite particular about his tea, though." "Particular in what way?" Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "He never used sugar from the bowl, said it was too sweet for his constitution. He always carried a little silver case with saccharin tablets, very old-fashioned, but he was quite set in his ways about it." Miss Marple's mild grey eyes sharpened with sudden interest. Here was a crucial detail that others might overlook, a personal habit that would make Mr. Finch uniquely vulnerable to a targeted poisoning attempt. Someone who knew about the saccharin case could easily have tampered with its contents, ensuring that only Mr. Finch would be affected. "This silver case," Inspector Slack continued. "Did you see him use it today?" Sarah nodded. "I noticed him take it out when he collected his tea. He was very discreet about it. He didn't like drawing attention to what he considered a personal weakness." Julian Ashworth, when his turn came, appeared increasingly haggard under Inspector Slack's relentless questioning. "These financial difficulties you mentioned," the inspector began without preamble, "how substantial were they exactly?" "Considerable," Julian admitted reluctantly, his hands trembling as he lit another cigarette. "I may have been overly optimistic about certain investment opportunities. My aunt has been most understanding about my temporary residence here. And you maintain you had no connection whatsoever to Mr. Finch?" "None at all," Julian replied too quickly. "I barely knew the man beyond casual greetings at church." But Mrs. Ashworth, when questioned about her conversation with Mr. Finch by the Rose Walk, revealed information that cast Julian's denials in a different light. "Mr. Finch had discovered something through his legal inquiries," she said carefully. "A matter concerning the estate that he believed had been handled incorrectly many years ago. He thought it might benefit him modestly. The implication was clear to everyone present if Mr. Finch had a legitimate claim to any portion of the Ashworth estate. Julian's already precarious financial position would become even more desperate." "Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, setting down her knitting, "you might want to examine whether Mr. Finch still has his saccharin case with him." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose, but he had learned to respect the elderly lady's observations. "Constable Reeves, check Mr. Finch's person for this silver case Miss Wickham described." The wait seemed interminable as Reeves carefully searched the body in the summer house. When he returned, his face was grim. "The case is there, sir, in his inner waistcoat pocket. But it's completely empty, not a single tablet remaining." The revelation sent a chill through the assembled villagers. Someone had known about Mr. Finch's habit, had access to his saccharin case, and had used that intimate knowledge to deliver poison with deadly precision. The murderer was not some random killer, but someone who understood Mr. Finch's personal routines well enough to exploit them. Inspector Slack's gaze swept over the assembled suspects with renewed intensity. The investigation had just taken a decidedly more personal turn. The discovery of the empty saccharine case sent a ripple of unease through Mrs. Ashworth's library, transforming what had been a methodical inquiry into something far more sinister. Inspector Slack's expression hardened as he absorbed the implications. "This confirms premeditation of the most calculated sort," he announced grimly. "Our murderer didn't simply poison a random teacup. They specifically targeted Mr. Finch's personal habits, ensuring he alone would consume the fatal dose." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she contemplated this revelation. The empty case troubled her in ways she couldn't yet articulate, though she sensed an important inconsistency lurking beneath the surface evidence. "Inspector," Dr. Hartwell interjected, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "I should mention that I was aware of Mr. Finch's condition. He consulted me several months ago about digestive troubles, and I recommended he avoid excessive sugar. That's when he mentioned his preference for saccharin tablets, said they were specially ordered from a chemist in London, a supplier he'd used for years." This information sharpened Inspector Slack's attention immediately. A London chemist suggests connections beyond what Mr. Finch revealed about his past. Who else knew about these tablets? The uncomfortable silence stretched until Sarah Wickham spoke reluctantly. "He was very discreet about using them. Said he didn't like drawing attention to what he considered a personal weakness. I only noticed because I helped serve tea so often at church functions." Miss Marple observed how Sarah's eyes flickered toward Julian, who had grown increasingly pale during the questioning. The young man's nervousness was palpable, his hands trembling as he lit yet another cigarette. "Mrs. Ashworth," Inspector Slack continued, "you mentioned estate matters. What exactly had Mr. Finch discovered?" Mrs. Ashworth's composure wavered slightly. "Something about a trust fund established by my late husband's brother, Charles Ashworth. There had apparently been confusion about beneficiaries when Charles died 25 years ago." Mr. Finch seemed convinced the solicitors had uncovered evidence of an error, something about a missing codicil to Charles's will. Julian's cigarette nearly slipped from his fingers at the word codicil. Miss Marple noted this reaction with particular interest, filing it away alongside her growing collection of observations. "There's something else," Mrs. Bantry announced with her characteristic directness. "Yesterday evening, after Mr. Finch received his registered letter, I saw him walking toward the village center carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. This was just after 7 o'clock. He seemed quite purposeful about it." "The post office," Inspector Slack mused. "Even closed, there's a collection box. Constable Reeves, contact the postal authorities immediately. I want to know what Mr. Finch posted last night." As Reeves hurried from the library, Miss Marple found herself pondering the curious contradiction that had been troubling her. If the poisoned saccharin tablets were the true delivery method, rendering Mr. Finch's case empty, why had someone taken such care to hide the teaspoon? Young Tommy had heard the spoon clinking against china just moments before discovering the body, suggesting the killer had barely escaped detection. Yet they had taken precious seconds to conceal the spoon beneath the chair, an act that seemed both desperate and calculated. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her thoughts. Reeves covered the mouthpiece as he spoke. "The clerk at Harbottle and Lane confirms substantial irregularities in an old trust, sir. They were arranging a meeting with Mr. Finch for next week to discuss his potential claim." Inspector Slack's gaze settled on Julian with obvious suspicion. "Mr. Ashworth, these financial difficulties of yours, how desperate had your situation become?" But Miss Marple was studying the evidence from a different angle entirely. Someone had orchestrated this murder with extraordinary care, manipulating not just the method but the very narrative of the crime. The empty saccharine case pointed to one conclusion, while the hidden spoon suggested another entirely. The contradiction itself might be the most important clue of all. The peaceful village of Street, Mary Mead was revealing secrets that had been buried for decades, and those secrets had proven deadly enough to kill for. Julian's face had drained of all color at Inspector Slack's pointed question about his financial desperation. His cigarette trembled between his fingers as he struggled to formulate a response. "Several £1,000s," he admitted in barely a whisper. "Gaming debts, primarily. The creditors have been most insistent about repayment." Mrs. Ashworth's sharp intake of breath revealed this was news to her. "Julian, you never mentioned the extent. I didn't want to burden you further, Aunt Cordelia. You've already been so generous." Inspector Slack wasted no time capitalizing on this revelation. "Constable Reeves, we'll search Mr. Finch's cottage immediately. Mrs. Ashworth, I'll need your housekeeper to accompany us, someone who might notice anything out of place. Mrs. Tanner, a practical woman of few words, led the small investigative party along the lane to Mr. Finch's neat ivy-covered cottage. Miss Marple, moving with her characteristic unhurried pace, observed the meticulous order that spoke of a man who valued precision above all else. The sitting room revealed little, initially a tidy writing desk, church newsletters, wilting meadow flowers, but Inspector Slack's methodical search of the desk drawers proved more illuminating. Inside lay correspondence files, a page headed "Charles Ashworth Trust," covered in careful calculations, and most significantly, a chemist's receipt from Finsbury and Company, London, dated 10 days earlier, for saccharin tablets, 2 tins. 2 tins, Inspector Slack murmured, his eyes sharpening. "Where are they now?" Mrs. Tanner suggested checking the pantry, where Mr. Finch kept his provisions with clockwork regularity. There, Miss Marple discovered an empty brown paper wrapper bearing the Finsbury crest and a length of green twine coiled beside it, but no tins were visible anywhere. "Most curious," Miss Marple observed mildly. "One would expect at least one unopened tin remaining. Careful men like Mr. Finch rarely exhaust their supplies completely." Their search was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Hargreaves, the head gardener, cap in hand and soil-dusted. "Beg pardon, Inspector, but I thought you should know I saw Mr. Finch near Peacock Alley about 10 minutes past 3. He wasn't alone. There was a lady with him, wearing a large straw hat with green ribbon. I was repairing the fountain valve and couldn't see her face clearly." This testimony sent a ripple of interest through the group. A companion so close to the time of death suggested either the last person to see Mr. Finch alive or possibly his killer. Back at the manor, Dr. Hartwell provided additional crucial information. "Inspector, I should mention that Mr. Finch consulted me several months ago about digestive troubles. During our conversation, he revealed he had worked in pharmaceutical research before retiring to Street, Mary Mead. He understood chemical properties quite well. That would explain the slight discoloration I noticed under his fingernails," Dr. Hartwell continued, "consistent with someone who handled laboratory chemicals regularly." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed this revelation. A man with pharmaceutical knowledge would certainly understand cyanide's properties, but he would also know proper safety procedures. The stained fingernails suggested recent chemical work, but for what purpose? "There's something else," Dr. Hartwell added reluctantly. "Last week, I overheard what seemed to be a heated discussion between Mr. Finch and Julian near the post office. Mr. Finch appeared quite distressed afterward, mentioning something about financial deceptions that needed addressing." Julian's face flushed crimson. "We merely disagreed about parish matters, nothing more significant than that." But Miss Marple was contemplating the growing contradictions. An empty saccharin case, missing tins from a recent delivery, a hidden teaspoon that seemed unnecessary if the poison was in the tablets, and now evidence of Mr. Finch's chemical expertise. The pieces suggested a puzzle far more complex than simple poisoning. The investigation was revealing that beneath Street, Mary Mead's peaceful surface lay currents of desperation, deception, and secrets dangerous enough to kill for. The evening shadows were deepening across Peacock Manor when Mrs. Weatherby burst into the library, flustered and indignant. "Inspector Slack, I must report a theft. My straw hat has been stolen, the one with the green ribbon that I wore to the morning service. I left it on the cloakroom peg by the side door before luncheon, and now it's completely vanished." Inspector Slack's head snapped up with immediate interest. The connection to Hargreaves's testimony about the mysterious woman was unmistakable. "When did you last see it, Mrs. Weatherby?" "Just after the raffle arrangements were finalized, around 2:30. The peg was quite crowded then with everyone's things." She paused, wringing her hands. "I only noticed it missing when you asked us. All to remain on the lawn." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "The side door, Mrs. Weatherby, that would be the one leading to the east terrace?" "Indeed," Mrs. Tanner confirmed. "Staff use it when carrying tea service to the grounds. It's typically left unlatched during fine weather for convenience." The implication hung heavy in the air. Someone had deliberately taken Mrs. Weatherby's distinctive hat as a disguise, allowing them to meet Mr. Finch while appearing to be someone else from a distance. Constable Reeves chose that moment to return from the post office, slightly breathless. "Inspector," the postal clerk confirmed. "Mr. Finch posted 2 items last evening, a small registered parcel addressed to Reverend Thornbury at the vicarage and a letter to his solicitors in Exeter. Both marked urgent and insured." Reverend Thornbury shifted uncomfortably. "He mentioned wanting to set things right during our telephone conversation. Perhaps he feared interference before he could complete whatever he felt compelled to do." "There's something else I must tell you," Sarah Wickham said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yesterday evening, around 8 o'clock, I saw someone leaving Mr. Finch's cottage through the garden gate. They were carrying what appeared to be a small package." Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. "Could you identify this person?" Sarah's eyes flickered nervously toward Julian, who had gone pale. The light was poor, but the height and build seemed familiar, though I cannot be absolutely certain. "That's impossible," Julian protested, his hands trembling as he reached for another cigarette. "I was at the Lamb and Flag until well past 9. Tom Weatherby can verify it." Mrs. Bantry's direct manner cut through the tension. "Tom Weatherby left the public house at 7:30 yesterday, Julian. I saw him walking home when I was tending my evening roses." The contradiction struck the room like a physical blow. Julian's cigarette case clattered to the floor, scattering its contents across the Persian carpet. Mrs. Ashworth, her composure finally cracking under the mounting pressure, spoke with visible reluctance. "There's something about Charles's trust fund that I haven't mentioned. It wasn't established for general charitable purposes. It was specifically intended for his research assistant's daughter, a young woman who had helped him with his botanical studies for several years." Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Inspector, when I examined Mr. Finch's cottage earlier, I noticed evidence of recent chemical work test tubes, measuring equipment, traces of various compounds. Given his pharmaceutical background, he was clearly conducting some form of analysis." Miss Marple's mild grey eyes had been moving thoughtfully between the assembled suspects throughout these revelations. "How interesting," she murmured, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "A man who understood chemistry intimately, found dead by poison after discovering financial irregularities and conducting private experiments. One might almost think he was investigating something himself." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Mr. Finch had uncovered a decades-old deception, gathered evidence, and made arrangements to expose the truth. But someone had been watching his activities carefully enough to strike before he could complete his mission. Inspector Slack surveyed the assembled suspects with renewed intensity. The investigation had revealed a web of deception, financial desperation, and carefully concealed secrets that stretched back 25 years. Secrets that had proven deadly enough to kill for. The revelation about Charles Ashworth's trust fund and Julian's contradictory alibi sent ripples of tension through the assembled group. Inspector Slack's methodical mind was clearly connecting these new facts to the mounting evidence against the young man. But Miss Marple found herself studying the subtle reactions of everyone present with her characteristic attention to human nature. Mrs. Tanner chose that moment to enter with obvious urgency, carrying something wrapped in her apron. "Inspector, I found this under the hydrangeas by the east door," she carefully revealed Mrs. Weatherby's missing straw hat, its green ribbon now frayed and bearing a distinctive brown stain that looked remarkably like tea. "That's definitely mine," Mrs. Weatherby confirmed, examining the damaged hat with dismay. "But I've never taken tea near the hydrangeas. Someone else was wearing it." Hargreaves, summoned to examine the recovered hat, nodded with certainty. "That's the green ribbon I saw. No mistake." The lady kept to the shadowed path, head down, moving careful-like. Couldn't make out the face, but I remember thinking she walked as though carrying something that might spill. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "How very observant of you, Mr. Hargreaves. People often imagine a hat disguises the person, but it's the way someone moves that truly tells the story. A person carrying a delicate teacup would indeed walk with particular care." The implication struck everyone simultaneously. Someone had deliberately borrowed Mrs. Weatherby's distinctive hat to meet Mr. Finch while appearing to be someone else from a distance. The careful disposal under the hydrangeas suggested both premeditation and an intimate knowledge of the manor's grounds. Constable Reeves returned at that moment, slightly breathless from his bicycle ride. "Inspector, Reverend Thornbury requests your immediate presence," he says. "The contents are most disturbing." The short walk to the vicarage allowed Miss Marple to observe how each suspect reacted to this development. Julian's hands trembled more noticeably as he lit yet another cigarette, while Sarah Wickham kept glancing nervously between him and Dr. Hartwell. Mrs. Ashworth maintained her composure, but Miss Marple noted how she kept touching her brooch, a gesture that typically indicated considerable inner turmoil. At the vicarage, Reverend Thornbury waited with obvious distress. On his desk lay an opened parcel containing several items: a small glass vial with white crystalline powder, detailed notes in Mr. Finch's careful handwriting, and a letter bearing yesterday's date. Dr. Hartwell examined the vial with professional interest. "This appears to be some form of chemical sample. Given Mr. Finch's pharmaceutical background, he was clearly conducting private analysis of something." Inspector Slack read portions of the accompanying letter aloud. "Mr. Finch writes that he had been experiencing unusual symptoms for several weeks: digestive troubles, fatigue, subtle changes in the taste of his regular medications. He suspected someone was attempting to harm him gradually and had begun testing various items from his household. Most methodical," Miss Marple observed mildly. "A man with his scientific training would naturally investigate such concerns systematically." The letter continued with Mr. Finch's discoveries about the Charles Ashworth Trust Fund. Through his legal inquiries, he had learned that the original beneficiary had been Charles's research assistant, whose daughter should have inherited the substantial annual payments upon her mother's death 23 years ago. However, someone had been fraudulently collecting these payments by forging documents and maintaining the deception that the original beneficiary was still alive. Mrs. Ashworth's face had grown increasingly pale during this revelation. "Inspector, I must confess that I never questioned the trust arrangements. The solicitors handled everything, and the payments seemed properly managed, if there has been fraud." Julian's cigarette case clattered to the floor, scattering its contents across the Persian carpet. His hands shook so violently he could barely retrieve the scattered cigarettes. "The financial motive becomes quite clear," Inspector Slack observed grimly. "Someone has been stealing substantial sums for over 2 decades. And Mr. Finch threatened to expose this fraud. But Miss Marple was contemplating the curious mixture of patience and desperation the evidence suggested. The gradual poisoning attempts indicated someone willing to wait months for results, while the final murder seemed almost panicked in its execution. The elaborate disguise with Mrs. Weatherby's hat showed careful planning, yet the hidden teaspoon suggested hasty cleanup after an unexpected interruption. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe we should examine whether Mr. Finch left any additional evidence at his cottage. A man conducting such careful investigations would likely have kept detailed records of his findings. The web of deception was proving far more complex than a simple murder for inheritance. Someone had been systematically defrauding the estate for decades, and when Mr. Finch threatened to expose this elaborate scheme, they had resorted to the most desperate measure of all. The return to Mr. Finch's cottage in the gathering dusk revealed the methodical nature of a man who had lived his final months in growing suspicion and fear. Miss Marple moved through the tidy rooms with her characteristic unhurried pace, her mild grey eyes taking in details that others might overlook. The cottage felt expectant rather than empty, as if it still held secrets waiting to be discovered. Inspector Slack's systematic search of the writing desk proved more fruitful on this second visit. Behind a loose panel in the desk's back wall, concealed with the ingenuity of someone who understood the value of careful documentation, lay a leather-bound journal and a manila envelope marked "Evidence to be opened only in event of my death." The journal's contents were damning in their meticulous detail. Mr. Finch had documented months of systematic investigation, beginning with his discovery that the trust fund's beneficiary, Miss Clara Vance, had died in a riding accident 23 years earlier, mere months after the trust was established. Yet, the payments had continued uninterrupted, flowing to someone who had been impersonating the deceased woman through forged correspondence and false documentation. "Most thorough," Miss Marple observed, reading over Inspector Slack's shoulder. "Mr. Finch was clearly a man who believed in proper evidence. See how he's traced the bank transfers, documented the forged signatures, even noted the timing of withdrawals. The journal revealed a disturbing pattern. Large sums had been withdrawn during periods of financial strain within prominent village families, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge of local circumstances. More alarming still were Mr. Finch's recent entries, documenting his own gradual poisoning. He had systematically tested his food, medications, and daily consumables, discovering traces of arsenic in quantities calculated to cause a slow, apparently natural decline. Hartwell examined the chemical analysis with professional interest. Whoever attempted this understood dosages precisely enough to weaken him gradually while avoiding immediate suspicion. When that failed, they resorted to more direct methods. The envelope contained additional evidence that sent ripples of unease through the assembled group. Photographs of forged documents, copies of bank records, and most significantly, a detailed timeline showing how the fraudulent payments coincided with various village events and financial pressures over the past 2 decades. Julian Ashworth's face had grown increasingly ashen as the evidence mounted. "I swear I knew nothing about any of this," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for another cigarette. "The trust payments were simply part of the estate's regular obligations," Mrs. Ashworth maintained, her composure with visible effort. "The solicitors handled all correspondence through their London office. I never questioned the arrangements, they seemed perfectly legitimate, but Miss Marple was studying the evidence from her characteristic angle of human psychology. What strikes me most," she said mildly, "is the patience this required. 23 years of careful deception, systematic fraud, gradual poisoning when discovery threatened. This suggests someone with both intimate knowledge of the original arrangements and the temperament for long-term planning." Sarah Wickham, who had remained unusually quiet, suddenly spoke with obvious distress. "There's something else I should mention. Last week, I noticed irregularities in the post office records, letters addressed to Miss Clara Vance that were collected by someone claiming to be her representative. The signature didn't match previous entries. "Who collected these letters?" Inspector Slack demanded. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she glanced around the group. The handwriting was familiar, but I can't be certain. It looked like someone trying to disguise their natural script. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she contemplated the assembled evidence. The case was revealing layers of deception that stretched back decades, involving someone with access to estate correspondence, knowledge of legal procedures, and the medical expertise to attempt gradual poisoning before resorting to murder. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe Mr. Finch's final precautions may yet provide the answers we seek. A man conducting such careful investigations would have taken steps to ensure his findings survived him." The peaceful village of Street, Mary Mead was proving to harbor secrets far darker than anyone had imagined, and those secrets had proven deadly enough to kill for. Miss Marple's suggestion about Mr. Finch's final precautions led the investigation party back through the cottage with renewed purpose. Her mild grey eyes had noticed something during their earlier search, a slight discoloration on the kitchen windowsill and the faint, sweet scent that seemed to linger despite the evening's cooling air. "Inspector," she said gently, pausing by the kitchen window, "might we examine the garden shed? A man conducting chemical experiments would need proper storage for his materials, and Mr. Finch was far too careful to keep dangerous substances in his living quarters." The small potting shed behind the cottage revealed itself to be more laboratory than storage space. Neat rows of glass vials lined makeshift shelves, each labeled in Mr. Finch's precise handwriting. Test tubes, measuring spoons, and a small spirit lamp suggested systematic analysis had been conducted here. Most significantly, Miss Marple discovered a hidden compartment beneath the workbench, containing a leather portfolio marked "Final Evidence," photographic documentation. The portfolio held a series of photographs taken with a small camera, positioned to observe the cottage's rear entrance. The images, captured over several weeks, showed the same figure repeatedly accessing Mr. Finch's home during his regular absences for church and village errands. Though taken from a distance, the person's distinctive gait and familiar silhouette were unmistakable to anyone who knew the village residents well. "Most methodical," Miss Marple observed, examining the timestamps on each photograph. Mr. Finch documented not only the chemical evidence of his poisoning but also identified who had been entering his home to administer it. Dr. Hartwell studied the photographs with growing unease. The systematic nature of these visits suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's daily routine. They knew precisely when he would be away and for how long. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened as he compared the photographic evidence to their earlier discoveries. This confirms the gradual arsenic poisoning through the saccharin tablets. But it raises the question, if the murderer had such regular access to Mr. Finch's home, why resort to public poisoning at the garden party? Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she contemplated this crucial inconsistency. Because, Inspector, Mr. Finch had grown too suspicious. Notice the dates on these final photographs. They stop abruptly 5 days ago. He had changed his locks and begun varying his routine. The murderer could no longer access his home safely. The investigation moved to Hargreaves's potting shed, where Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately noted the ring of dust on a high shelf where something had recently been removed. A crumpled piece of muslin lay in the corner, stained with a brownish residue that carried a faint, bitter almond scent. "Cherry laurel," she murmured, examining a bruised leaf from the decorative hedging. When processed properly, it produces a concentrate with properties very similar to cyanide. Someone with botanical knowledge would understand its potential. Mrs. Tanner, summoned to account for activity near the shed, provided crucial testimony. Around 20 minutes to 4, I saw someone hurrying from the shed toward the manor's side entrance. They wore Mrs. Weatherby's straw hat and carried something carefully, like they were afraid of spilling. The sleeve cuff was damp, as if they'd been handling liquid. Miss Marple's mild grey eyes settled thoughtfully on Sarah Wickham, who had grown increasingly pale during these revelations. "My dear, you mentioned noticing irregularities in the postal records letters for Miss Clara Vance, collected by someone claiming to represent her. Such detailed observation suggests considerable familiarity with the correspondence patterns." Sarah's hands trembled as she clasped them together. I process all the village mail. It's natural to notice unusual requests." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. "And your position would provide perfect access to estate correspondence, legal documents, and the means to maintain elaborate deceptions over many years. Someone in your position could easily intercept letters, forge responses, and ensure that inquiries never reached their intended recipients." Dr. Hartwell stared at Sarah with dawning horror. "Sarah, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing yet, Doctor," Miss Marple interrupted with characteristic mildness. "But I am observing that our murderer possessed several specific capabilities: intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's habits, access to his home for gradual poisoning, understanding of botanical chemistry, and the means to maintain a complex fraud for over 2 decades. Most tellingly, they knew about his saccharine case well enough to empty it as misdirection after using a different poison entirely." The weight of accumulated evidence settled over the group like evening shadows. Sarah Wickham's composure was cracking visibly, her eyes darting between the assembled faces with growing desperation. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we have sufficient evidence to understand both the method and the motive. Tomorrow, perhaps we might arrange a small gathering at the vicarage, nothing formal. Simply tea and conversation. Sometimes, when people are comfortable, they reveal more than they intend." The peaceful village investigation was approaching its inevitable conclusion, and the web of deception that had claimed Arthur Finch's life was finally beginning to unravel completely. The following afternoon found the vicarage drawing room arranged with Miss Marple's characteristic attention to meaningful detail. She had arrived early, positioning herself near the tea service with her knitting bag and an air of gentle purpose. When the others gathered, Inspector Slack, watchful and patient, Mrs. Ashworth pale with strain, Julian nervously smoking, Dr. Hartwell grave with concern, and Sarah Wickham visibly anxious, Miss Marple welcomed them with domestic warmth that seemed to belie the gravity of their circumstances. "How kind of you all to come for tea," she said mildly, settling into her chair with her knitting. "Sarah, my dear, you pour so beautifully at church functions. Would you be so good as to serve today? These old hands aren't quite as steady as they once were." Sarah hesitated for just a moment, a pause so brief that only Miss Marple's trained eye caught its significance before taking her place behind the tea service. "Of course, Miss Marple. Milk or lemon for everyone?" As Sarah began pouring, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly while she spoke in her characteristic meandering way. "I was just thinking about dear Mrs. Pringle from my village. Such a lovely woman. But she had the most peculiar habit of borrowing things and quite forgetting to return them. Once she borrowed my gardening hat, a rather distinctive straw one with green ribbon, and then quite insisted she'd never seen it." Her mild grey eyes flickered meaningfully toward the group. "Of course, when such borrowed items are used for purposes other than intended, it rather changes the complexion of things, doesn't it?" Sarah's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she passed Inspector Slack his cup. Miss Marple noted how the young woman's eyes darted toward the delicate silver teaspoon on the tray, then quickly away, as if the sight of it caused her physical discomfort. "And then there was young Timothy at our post office," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Such a bright lad, with the most remarkable eye for detail. He could spot inconsistencies in handwriting that others missed entirely, particularly when signatures on collected correspondence didn't quite match the original hand. Amazing how a practiced forger can maintain deception for years, yet still betray themselves in small details." The color drained from Sarah's face as she nearly dropped the milk jug. Dr. Hartwell reached out instinctively to steady her, his expression growing troubled as he observed her obvious distress. "Of course," Miss Marple mused, selecting a piece of seed cake. The most fascinating cases involve people who must maintain elaborate deceptions over many years. It requires such patience, such careful attention to detail. Rather like tending a garden, really one must constantly nurture the illusion, pruning away anything that might expose the truth beneath. She paused to sip her tea thoughtfully. I once knew a woman who spent decades impersonating her deceased aunt, collecting the poor dear's pension through forged letters. She managed beautifully until a solicitor noticed her unfortunate tendency to make extravagant loops on her capital letters, quite different from the aunt's cramped hand. Sarah set down her teacup with such force that it rattled against the saucer. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet, my dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. "But I am observing how certain objects seem to distress you. That teaspoon, for instance. Such a simple thing, really. Yet you've avoided touching it entirely, almost as if it held some particular significance." Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed interest, recognizing the psychological pressure Miss Marple was applying with her characteristic subtlety. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm, "when someone goes to such trouble to hide a teaspoon after committing murder, it suggests they believe that spoon could somehow incriminate them. But if the poison was truly delivered through tampered saccharin tablets, why would a teaspoon matter at all?" Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid. Her hands clasped together tightly in her lap as she struggled to maintain her composure under Miss Marple's relentless but gentle questioning. "The answer, of course, is that the saccharin case was merely misdirection. The real poison was stirred directly into the tea, requiring a spoon that then needed to be hidden quickly when young Tommy's footsteps approached. Someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's habits, access to his home for the gradual arsenic poisoning, and the botanical expertise to process cherry laurel into a deadly concentrate." The room fell into tense silence as Miss Marple's words settled over the assembled group. Sarah Wickham's carefully maintained facade was cracking visibly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning realization that her decades-long deception was finally unraveling. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, setting down her knitting, "it's time we discussed Clara Vance and what really happened to the trust fund 23 years ago." The mention of Clara Vance struck Sarah Wickham like a physical blow. Her teacup trembled violently in her hands, the delicate porcelain chattering against its saucer as 23 years of carefully maintained deception began to crumble before Miss Marple's gentle but relentless gaze. "Clara Vance was my mother," Sarah whispered, the words seeming to tear themselves from her throat. Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the investigation, finally shattered completely. "She died in that riding accident when I was barely 15, leaving me utterly alone in the world." Dr. Hartwell stared at her in shocked disbelief. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me? I thought I knew you." "Because I was terrified," she replied, tears streaming down her face. "At first, it seemed like temporary survival. Mother had taught me to copy her handwriting for household correspondence when she was ill. When the solicitor's letters arrived after her death, I simply continued responding as Clara Vance. I told myself it would only be for a few months, until I could find proper employment." Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled completely as she listened with compassionate attention. But months became years, and the deception grew more elaborate with each passing season. You had to create an entire fictional life for your deceased mother. Every few years, I relocated to avoid suspicion, always ensuring the trust payments continued flowing to accounts I could access. Sarah's voice grew hollow with exhaustion. When the position at Street, Mary Mead became available, it seemed perfect, close enough to monitor inquiries about the Ashworth Trust, remote enough that no one would question my background. Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. "But Mr. Finch's legal inquiries threatened everything you had built." He was so methodical, so persistent. When he began corresponding with Harbottle and Lane about trust irregularities, I knew discovery was inevitable. Sarah's hands shook uncontrollably. I tried discouraging him gently at first. When that failed, I began adding small amounts of arsenic to his saccharin tablets during visits to his cottage. I had copied his keys months earlier when he asked me to collect mail during an illness. The gradual poisoning wasn't working quickly enough, Miss Marple observed quietly. He grew suspicious, changed his locks, began varying his routine. Yesterday, when I learned he had scheduled a meeting with Reverend Thornbury to discuss matters of conscience, I knew he was preparing to expose everything. Sarah's voice cracked. I couldn't let 23 years of survival be destroyed by one man's moral certainties. Miss Marple leaned forward with gentle understanding. So, you borrowed Mrs. Weatherby's hat, processed cherry laurel from the decorative hedging into concentrated poison, and arranged to meet Mr. Finch at the summer house. I told him there had been irregularities in his correspondence requiring clarification. He was always so concerned about proper procedures. Sarah's final defenses crumbled. I stirred the poison directly into his tea, while he examined false documents I had prepared. When Tommy's footsteps approached, I barely had time to hide the spoon and escape through the back path. The vicarage drawing room fell into profound silence as the full scope of deception became clear. Mrs. Ashworth sat frozen, her face reflecting the betrayal of someone she had known since childhood. Julian, though cleared of suspicion, appeared utterly drained. Dr. Hartwell stared into his teacup, struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he loved with the calculating murderer she had revealed herself to be. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with finality. Sarah Wickham, I am arresting you for the murder of Arthur Finch and fraudulent appropriation of trust funds belonging to the Ashworth estate. As Constable Reeves gently led Sarah away, her shoulders shaking with exhausted sobs, Miss Marple reflected sadly on how fear and desperation could transform an innocent young woman into something far darker. The peaceful village would recover from this tragedy, but the scars would linger long after justice had been served. Later, as twilight settled over Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and contemplated the endless complexity of human nature. People rarely began as villains, she mused. They drifted, step by manageable step, until the only path remaining led through Peacock Alley, where careful footprints marked the final, desperate measures of a life built on deception. The silence that settled over the vicarage drawing room after Sarah's arrest was profound, weighted with the collapse of carefully maintained illusions. Dr. Hartwell sat motionless, staring at the empty chair, where the woman he had hoped to marry had just confessed to decades of fraud and murder. Mrs. Ashworth pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, while Julian slumped with the exhausted relief of a man finally cleared of suspicion. Miss Marple set down her knitting with characteristic gentleness. It is always tragic, she began, softly, when fear transforms someone from victim to villain. Sarah began as a frightened 15-year-old facing destitution after her mother's death. The trust fund was rightfully hers if she had simply revealed her identity when she came of age. The payments would have transferred to her legitimately. Inspector Slack nodded grimly, the irony being that her elaborate deception was entirely unnecessary. Indeed, but once begun, each small lie demanded larger ones to sustain it. 23 years of maintaining fictional correspondence, forging signatures, creating false identities, all to protect what should have been hers by right. Miss Marple's mild grey eyes reflected deep sadness. The empty saccharin case was clever misdirection, designed to suggest the poison was in Mr. Finch's tablets. But young Tommy's observation of the clinking spoon revealed the truth. The poison was stirred directly into the tea, requiring the spoon to be hastily hidden when discovery threatened. Dr. Hartwell finally spoke, his voice hollow. Her position at the post office gave her access to everything: estate correspondence, legal inquiries, Mr. Finch's personal habits. She could intercept letters, forge responses, maintain the illusion of Clara Vance's continued existence. Most methodically, Miss Marple agreed. She understood that Mr. Finch never used sugar, always carrying his silver saccharin case. When gradual arsenic poisoning through tampered tablets failed to work quickly enough, she processed cherry laurel from the manor's own grounds into concentrated poison. Mrs. Weatherby's distinctive hat provided the perfect disguise for their final meeting. Mrs. Ashworth looked up through her tears. All these years, she seemed so genuinely part of our community. Because in many ways, she was genuine, Miss Marple replied with characteristic insight. Her efficiency, her care for village affairs, even her affection for Dr. Hartwell, none of that was entirely false. People are rarely completely one thing or another. The tragedy is how desperation can corrupt even authentic relationships when secrets grow too heavy to bear. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the participants began to disperse, each carrying the weight of shattered assumptions about someone they had trusted implicitly. The village would need time to process this betrayal of their most basic institutions, their postal service, their social fabric, their faith in familiar faces. Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage, reflecting on the eternal patterns that made such tragedies possible. Fear, isolation, and the gradual corruption of initially innocent choices could transform anyone into something unrecognizable. Yet the same community that harbored such darkness also demonstrated remarkable capacity for healing, forgiveness, and the patient restoration of trust. In her garden, she resumed her knitting as twilight settled over Street Mary Mead. The peaceful rhythm would continue, marked now by deeper understanding of how easily ordinary people could drift toward extraordinary crimes when circumstances aligned in particularly dangerous ways. The death at Peacock Alley had reminded them all that even the most tranquil communities must remain vigilant against the small deceptions that could grow into something far more deadly. The church bells chimed the evening hour, calling the village to reflection and renewal. Life would continue with all its complexity, requiring constant attention to the bonds of trust that held communities together. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the gathering darkness, creating something beautiful and useful from simple materials, much like the patient work of rebuilding faith after it had been so thoroughly tested by secrets, lies, and murder most calculated.